The boy walked onto the stage holding an envelope. He handed it to Simon Cowell. And the entire studio fell silent. It was June 2023. America's Got Talent. The Pasadena Civic Auditorium packed with over 3,000 people. Cameras rolling. Judges seated at their iconic red desk. Another Tuesday night audition. Another hopeful contestant stepping into the spotlight. The boy was 14 years old. Brown hair, simple clothes. Jeans and a button-down shirt that looked slightly too big for him, like maybe it had belonged to someone else first. He walked to center stage with careful, measured steps, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes scanning the judges' table until they locked on Simon Cowell. Host Terry Crews greeted him with his usual energy. "Welcome to America's Got Talent. What's your name, young man?" "My name is Daniel Martinez," the boy said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm 14. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. And what are you going to do for us today, Daniel?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was aged, the paper slightly yellowed, the edges worn from being handled many times over many years. He held it up toward the judge's table. Specifically toward Simon. "Before I audition," Daniel said, "I need to give this to Mr. Cowell." The audience murmured. This wasn't standard procedure. Contestants didn't approach the judges before performing. They sang or danced or did magic tricks or juggled. They didn't walk up with envelopes. Simon leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, that familiar expression of skeptical curiosity on his face. "What is it?" "It's a letter," Daniel said. "From my father. He wrote it 12 years ago. Before he died. He wrote it to you." The murmuring stopped. The studio went completely silent. Simon's arms uncrossed slowly. His expression shifted. Something between confusion and caution. "To me?" "Yes, sir." Terry Crews looked at the producers in the wings, uncertain how to proceed. This had never happened before. Simon stood up. Not the casual standing he sometimes did during performances. This was different. Deliberate. He stepped out from behind the judge's desk and walked toward the stage, his eyes never leaving the envelope in Daniel's hand. Simon stopped the show. No one knew what was happening. The control room erupted. Director David Friedman was talking rapidly into his headset. "What's Simon doing? Do we have clearance for this? Should we cut?" Executive producer Sam Donnelly stood behind David, watching the monitors. "Keep rolling," Sam said quietly. "Whatever this is, it's real. Keep the cameras on them." Simon reached the front of the stage. Daniel descended the 3 steps that separated the performance area from the floor, the envelope still clutched in his hand. He stopped directly in front of Simon. Up close, Simon could see the boy was trembling. Could see the tears forming in his eyes that he was fighting to hold back. "Why did your father write to me?" Simon asked, his voice lower now, gentler than the audience was used to hearing. "Because 12 years ago, you rejected him," Daniel said simply. "You told him he wasn't good enough. You told him to give up. And 2 weeks later, he died believing you were right." The collective gasp from the audience was audible even over the ambient sound of the massive theater. Howie Mandel leaned forward at the judge's table. Heidi Klum's hand went to her mouth. Sofia Vergara looked stricken. Simon's jaw tightened. "What was your father's name?" "Robert Martinez. He auditioned for you in 2011. Season 6. He sang. You stopped him halfway through and said..." Daniel's voice cracked. He took a breath. "You said he should find a different dream." Simon closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, something in his expression had changed. "I remember," he said quietly. "He wrote this letter that night," Daniel continued, holding out the envelope. "Before he got sick. Before the cancer took him. He wrote it because he wanted you to know something. And he made me promise that if I ever got the chance, I would give it to you. So here I am." Simon took the envelope with both hands. The paper felt fragile, like it might disintegrate if he held it too tightly. His name was written on the front in shaky handwriting. To Simon Cowell. "Can I read it?" Simon asked. Daniel nodded. "That's why I'm here. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 2011. Robert Martinez wasn't always Robert Martinez, terminal cancer patient and failed auditioner. In 2011, he was a 38-year-old high school music teacher in Phoenix, Arizona. He taught choir. He directed the school musicals. He had a wife, Maria, and a 2-year-old son named Daniel who was just learning to talk. Robert loved music more than almost anything. He'd grown up singing in church, had studied vocal performance in college, had dreamed of making it as a professional singer but had settled into teaching because it paid the bills and let him stay close to the thing he loved. But the dream never quite died. Every year, he'd watch singing competitions on television, American Idol, The Voice, America's Got Talent, and wonder what if. What if he'd tried harder? What if he'd been braver? What if he'd taken that risk when he was younger? In early 2011, Maria gave him an ultimatum. Not a cruel one. A loving one. "You're 40 in 2 years," she said, sitting across from him at their kitchen table while 2-year-old Daniel played with blocks on the floor. "If you don't try now, you're going to spend the rest of your life wondering. Go audition for one of these shows. Sing. Get it out of your system. Win or lose, at least you'll know." Robert was terrified. He was a high school choir teacher, not a performer. He was 40 pounds overweight. He was going bald. He wasn't 22 and beautiful like the contestants who seemed to get all the attention. But Maria was right. If he didn't try, he'd always wonder. He chose America's Got Talent. The auditions were coming to Phoenix. He could try out without having to travel far from his family. He practiced for 6 weeks, working on a song his own father had loved, an old ballad from the 1960s about hope and second chances. The audition was in May 2011. Robert stood backstage at the Orpheum Theater in downtown Phoenix, surrounded by singers and dancers and acrobats half his age, all of them vibrant and confident, and everything he wasn't. When his number was called, he walked onto that stage with his heart pounding so hard he thought the judges would be able to hear it. Simon Cowell sat at the center of the judges' table. This was before AGT had the 4-judge format, back when it was just 3, Simon, Sharon Osbourne, and Howie Mandel. "What's your name?" Simon asked, his tone already carrying that edge of bored skepticism. "Robert Martinez. I'm a high school choir teacher from Phoenix. And you're here because I've always wondered if I was good enough. I guess I'm here to find out." Simon nodded, unimpressed. "Go ahead," Robert sang. He made it through maybe 45 seconds before Simon raised his hand. "Stop. Stop, please." The music cut out. Robert stood frozen in the spotlight, the microphone still in his hand. "Robert," Simon said, his voice clinical, almost bored. "I'm going to be honest with you because that's what we do here. You're a perfectly adequate singer. Probably great for teaching high school kids. But this competition is about finding extraordinary talent, not adequate talent. You're not going to make it. You should probably stick to teaching and find a different dream." Sharon and Howie looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict him. The audience was silent. Robert stood there for a few more seconds, nodded once, and walked off stage. He drove home to Maria and 2-year-old Daniel. He didn't cry. He just went into their bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for 2 hours. He was right. Robert told Maria that night. "I'm not good enough. I never was." 3 weeks later, Robert was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 to 9 months. He lived for 7 months. Long enough to see Daniel turn 3. Long enough to write letters to his son. Letters for birthdays he wouldn't be there for graduations he wouldn't attend, for a wedding he'd never see. and long enough to write one letter to Simon Cowell. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this performance is still ahead. Simon stood in the middle of the Pasadena Civic Auditorium with Robert Martinez's letter in his hands. 3,000 people watching him. Cameras broadcasting to millions. Daniel standing 3 feet away, tears now streaming openly down his face. Simon opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same aged quality as the envelope, covered in that same shaky handwriting. He read it silently at first. His jaw clenched. His hands began to shake. By the time he reached the bottom of the page, tears were running down his face. Simon Cowell, who had built a career on being brutally honest and emotionally detached, was crying on live television. He looked up at Daniel. "Did you read this?" "Yes, sir. My mom showed it to me when I turned 13. She said it was time I knew what my father wanted to say." Simon looked back down at the letter, then out at the audience. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Robert wrote this 2 days before he died," Simon said, his words carrying through the theater. "He wrote it knowing he wouldn't be here to deliver it himself. And he asked his son, his 2-year-old son, to give it to me if he ever got the chance." The audience was completely still. Even the judges behind their desk had stopped moving. In this letter, Simon continued, "Robert doesn't blame me. He doesn't tell me I was wrong. He thanks me." A sound rippled through the crowd. Confusion. Disbelief. "He thanks me," Simon repeated, "because he says my rejection made him realize something. That he'd spent his whole life measuring his worth by whether strangers thought he was extraordinary. And that he'd forgotten the people who already thought he was extraordinary. His wife, his son, his students. He wrote that in the 7 months after I rejected him and before he died, he stopped trying to prove himself to the world and started pouring everything he had into the people who already loved him." Simon's voice broke. He had to stop and compose himself. He wrote that I gave him the greatest gift anyone ever gave him. I freed him from needing external validation. I reminded him that being adequate at the thing you love, for the people who matter, is worth more than being extraordinary for strangers. Simon looked at Daniel. "Your father asked you to come here. Not to make me feel guilty, but to prove something." "What did he ask you to prove?" Daniel wiped his eyes. "He asked me to prove that he was right. That being good enough for the people you love matters more than being the best." "And how are you supposed to prove that?" "By singing," Daniel said. "The same song he sang. The one you stopped him from finishing." Backstage, producers were begging him to continue, but he didn't. Simon folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He placed both hands on Daniel's shoulders. "Before you sing," Simon said, "I need you to understand something. And I need everyone here to hear this." He turned to face the audience directly. "I've been doing this job for over 20 years. I've rejected thousands of people. Most of them, I don't remember. Your father, I do remember. And what I told him that day was true in the narrowest sense. He wasn't going to win a singing competition. But I was wrong about what mattered." Simon's voice cracked. "Your father was right, Daniel. And I'm sorry I didn't tell him that when I had the chance." He stepped back. "Sing his song. Finish what he started." Daniel walked back to center stage. The music began. That same ballad from 1960s about hope and second chances. His voice was clear, untrained and perfect. Beautiful not because it was technically flawless, but because every note carried his father's legacy. Simon stood at the edge of the stage, tears streaming down his face, listening. When Daniel finished, the entire auditorium rose as one. Simon didn't return to his desk. He walked straight to the golden buzzer and slammed his hand down. Golden confetti exploded. Daniel collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Simon climbed onto the stage and pulled the boy into an embrace. Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. After the show, Simon had Robert's letter framed. It hangs in his dressing room at every AGT taping. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, "Being good enough for the people you love matters more than being the best." Daniel didn't win AGT. But he didn't need to. He'd already proven what his father asked him to prove.